The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of the Hillcrest Country Club ballroom. 200 guests turned to stare. My stepmother Victoria's perfectly manicured hand flew to her chest in mock horror. But I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at the man in the navy dress uniform who had just walked through the mahogany doors. The man whose voice had just cut through 20 years of lies with 4 simple words. Sergeant Major Eva Carter. 20 years. That's how long I'd been dead to this family. 20 years since I walked out of this very ballroom during my own engagement party, leaving behind a trust fund worth $47 million, a fiancé chosen by my father, and a family who saw me as nothing more than a chess piece in their social games. They thought I was weak. They thought I'd crumble. What they didn't know was that I'd spent those 20 years becoming someone they could never control. Someone they could never break again. But there was something else they didn't know. Something that would destroy everything they'd built on my supposed death. And tonight, at my father's 75th birthday celebration, surrounded by senators, judges, and the cream of Washington, D.C. society, I was finally ready to use it. Let me take you back to where it all began. Because some stories don't start with the first lie. They start with the first truth that gets buried alive. 22 years ago, I was Eva Elizabeth Whitmore, heir to the Whitmore steel fortune, Stanford Law School bound, engaged to Ethan Thornfield III, a man whose greatest accomplishment was being born into the right family. I was 19, naive, and desperate for my father's approval. I thought if I played by his rules long enough, he might actually see me as his daughter instead of his greatest disappointment. You see, I'd made the mistake of being born female in a family that needed a male heir. My father, Richard Whitmore, built his empire on the belief that women were decorative accessories, not decision-makers. My stepmother Victoria, who married him 6 months after my mother's funeral, reinforced this belief with every breath she took. She had 2 sons from her previous marriage, Ethan and David. And from the moment she walked into our Connecticut mansion, she made it clear that there was only room for one daughter in this family. And it wasn't going to be me. The engagement party was her masterpiece. 500 guests, crystal chandeliers, a string quartet flown in from Vienna. I stood there in a white Vera Wang gown that cost more than most people's cars, smiling while Ethan announced our wedding plans to a crowd that treated me like a prized breeding mare. That's when I overheard them. Victoria and my father standing by the French doors leading to the garden, their voices low but not low enough. Once she's married to Ethan, the trust fund transfers to him, correct? Victoria asked. Completely. She'll have a monthly allowance, but Ethan will control the principal. As it should be. And if something were to happen to her before the wedding? My father's laugh was cold. The money would revert to the family estate. But nothing's going to happen, Victoria. She's too weak to do anything but what she's told. I stood there, invisible in my own engagement party, listening to them plan my financial execution. But it was Victoria's next words that changed everything. Well, if she ever becomes problematic, accidents do happen. Remember what happened to Catherine. Catherine, my mother, who died in a car accident when I was 12. An accident that had never quite made sense. That's when I knew. I wasn't just trapped in this family. I was in danger. I walked out of that party without a word. Drove straight to the nearest military recruitment office. By dawn, I'd enlisted in the army under my middle name and my mother's maiden name, Eva Elizabeth Carter. By noon, I was on a bus to basic training. I left behind my trust fund, my name, my entire identity. But I took something with me that they'd never know about. You see, 3 days before the engagement party, I'd been in my father's study looking for a book when I accidentally knocked over a picture frame. Behind it, taped to the back of the frame, was a key. A key to a safety deposit box I wasn't supposed to know about. Inside that box, I found documents that would destroy my father, Victoria, and half of Washington's political elite. Evidence of bribery, money laundering, and yes, proof that my mother's accident wasn't an accident at all. I made copies of everything. Then I put the originals back and walked away. But I kept those copies hidden, waiting for the right moment. Because I learned something that night. The best revenge isn't immediate. Strategic. The army became my sanctuary. For the first time in my life, I was judged on my abilities, not my gender or my last name. I excelled. Became a communications specialist. Rose through the ranks faster than anyone expected. But more importantly, I learned skills my privileged upbringing never taught me. Surveillance, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare. I spent 20 years building a new identity while keeping tabs on my old family. I knew when Victoria's son David died in a skiing accident in Switzerland. I knew when Ethan married another socialite named Caroline and had 3 children. I knew when my father's company went public and made him a billionaire. And I knew about every illegal deal, every bribe, every cover-up they orchestrated to stay on top. But what they didn't know was that I'd been watching. Waiting. 3 months ago I received intelligence that changed everything. My father was dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. He had maybe 6 months left. Victoria and Ethan were already positioning themselves to take over the company and liquidate assets before the inevitable investigations began. They thought they were safe because the only person who could expose them was dead. Except I wasn't dead. I was Sergeant Major Eva Carter, a decorated veteran with security clearance they could only dream of and connections they couldn't imagine. And I had something they needed. You see, that safety deposit box key I'd found 20 years ago? It wasn't the only one. After my mother's death, she'd hidden evidence of her own. Evidence that I'd finally tracked down. Evidence that would not only prove she was murdered but would implicate Victoria, my father, and a conspiracy that reached all the way to the Supreme Court. My mother hadn't been the submissive wife they painted her as. She'd been an investigative journalist before her marriage and she'd never stopped digging. The car accident that killed her? She'd been on her way to meet with an FBI agent about a story she was working on. A story about political corruption and murder that would have brought down some of the most powerful people in the country. Victoria didn't just want her out of the way for my father's money. She wanted her silenced. But here's the thing about mothers. Even dead ones can protect their daughters. All those years I thought I was an orphan, I actually had a guardian angel leaving breadcrumbs for me to find. And find them I did. The plan came together like a military operation because that's exactly what it was. I'd learned from the best generals who could topple governments with nothing but information and perfect timing. This was my final mission, and unlike the wars I'd fought overseas, this one was personal. First, I needed to get close to them without being recognized. 20 years of military life had changed me. I was leaner, stronger, my brown hair now short and streaked with premature gray from stress and combat. I wore glasses now, a necessity after an IED explosion in Afghanistan damaged my vision. Most importantly, I carried myself differently. The scared 19-year-old girl who'd fled in a wedding dress was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd commanded troops in combat zones and earned the respect of people who didn't give it easily. I started by getting a job at Whitmore Industries. Not in the corporate offices. Victoria would have recognized me immediately. Instead, I became part of the security detail for corporate events. Military experience was valued there, and my security clearance made me an attractive hire. For 3 months, I observed their routines, their weaknesses, their secrets. That's when I discovered Ethan's gambling problem, and David's widow's drug addiction, and the fact that Victoria was having an affair with a federal judge, and that my father, despite his public image as a family man, had 3 illegitimate children he was paying to keep quiet. But most importantly, I learned about the birthday party. Richard Whitmore's 75th birthday celebration was going to be the event of the season. Every powerful person in Washington would be there. It was the perfect stage for the final act. I spent weeks planning every detail. The guest list. The security protocols. The media coverage. Everything had to be perfect because I would only get one chance. One moment to reveal 20 years of lies and bring justice for my mother's murder. But I needed an ally. Someone on the inside who could help me navigate the political minefield I was about to create. That's when I reached out to Colonel James Mitchell, my former commanding officer and the man who'd walked through those ballroom doors tonight. Mitchell owed me his life. I'd saved his unit during an ambush in Iraq, taking shrapnel in the process that ended my active combat career. He'd been trying to repay that debt for years. When I told him what I needed, he didn't ask questions. He just said, "When and where, Sergeant Major?" The night of the party, I stood in the servants' entrance of the Hillcrest Country Club, wearing a black dress that had cost 2 months of military pay. It was the first dress I'd worn in 20 years and it felt like armor. Around my neck hung my mother's locket, the one piece of jewelry I'd taken when I fled. Inside it was a picture of us together when I was 8 years old. She was smiling, her eyes bright with the kind of intelligence that had ultimately gotten her killed. "For you, Mom," I whispered as I walked into the ballroom. The place looked exactly as I remembered. Crystal chandeliers casting rainbow light across the marble floors. Waiters in white jackets carrying silver trays of champagne. The cream of society mingling in their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, discussing deals worth billions while children starved in the streets outside. I saw my father immediately. 20 years had aged him harshly. The cancer had stolen his height, his presence, his commanding voice. He looked small, diminished, clinging to Victoria's arm as she guided him from group to group like a prized possession. She, on the other hand, looked exactly the same. Plastic surgery and personal trainers had preserved her artificial beauty, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. She was already planning his funeral. Ethan was there too, with his picture-perfect wife and their 3 children. He'd grown soft and arrogant, his face flushed with too much alcohol and too many rich meals. He held court near the bar, telling stories about his latest business conquests to a group of sycophants who laughed at his jokes because they had to. For a moment, I felt like that 19-year-old girl again, intimidated by their power and wealth. But then I touched my mother's locket and remembered who I'd become. I wasn't here to beg for acceptance. I was here to deliver justice. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, listening to conversations, gathering intelligence. The political corruption was worse than I'd imagined. Judges being bought. Senators being blackmailed. Environmental regulations being ignored in exchange for campaign contributions. My family wasn't just wealthy. They were criminals running a criminal enterprise disguised as high society. But I waited. Patience is a soldier's greatest weapon, and I'd learned to use it well. At exactly 9:47 p.m., the lights dimmed for my father's birthday speech. He stood at the podium, Victoria beside him like a vulture waiting for its meal to die. His voice was weak, but his words were the same arrogant nonsense I'd heard my entire childhood about family legacy and traditional values. That's when I gave Mitchell the signal. A simple hand gesture that had once meant, execute the mission in a war zone. The ballroom doors opened. Every head turned to see Colonel James Mitchell in his dress blues, his chest covered in ribbons and medals that commanded respect even in this room full of powerful people. Behind him walked 2 FBI agents and a woman I'd been hoping to see for 20 years, Agent Rebecca Martinez, the FBI agent my mother had been going to meet the night she died. Ladies and gentlemen, Mitchell's voice boomed across the ballroom, trained to carry over the sound of gunfire and chaos. I apologize for the interruption, but we're looking for someone who's been dead for 20 years. He paused, letting the confusion ripple through the crowd. Then his eyes found mine across the room. Sergeant Major Eva Carter, would you please step forward? The champagne glass slipped from Victoria's fingers. That's where our story began. With the sound of crystal shattering against marble and the look of pure terror in my stepmother's eyes as she realized her greatest fear had just walked back from the dead. But the real shock was yet to come. I walked through that crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. Conversations stopped. Breathing stopped. The only sound was the click of my heels against the marble floor as I made my way to the front of the room. I could feel their eyes on me, the whispers starting to build as recognition dawned on some faces. Impossible, I heard Ethan whisper to his wife. She's dead. She died in that car crash in California. Car crash. So that's the story they'd told. Neat, clean, final. No messy investigations or inconvenient questions. I reached the front of the room and turned to face the crowd. My father looked like he'd seen a ghost, which I suppose he had. Victoria's face had gone chalk white beneath her expertly applied makeup. But it was Ethan who broke first. This is insane, he sputtered, his voice carrying across the silent room. That's not Eva Whitmore. Eva is dead. We had a funeral. We have a death certificate. Do you? Agent Martinez stepped forward, her badge gleaming under the chandeliers. Because according to our records, no Eva Whitmore ever died in California 20 years ago. But we do have records of a Eva Carter who enlisted in the U.S. Army on the same day your sister disappeared. The room erupted in whispers. I let them talk, let the speculation build. This was psychological warfare at its finest. Let your enemies destroy themselves with their own assumptions. Furthermore, Martinez continued, we have evidence that the death certificate for Eva Whitmore was falsified by someone with access to high-level government connections. Someone who needed her legally dead for financial purposes. Victoria found her voice first. Always the survivor, always ready to fight. This is ridiculous. Even if this woman is Eva, and I'm not saying she is, what does it matter? She abandoned her family. She walked away from everything. I did walk away, I said, finally speaking. My voice was different now, stronger, commanding. 20 years of giving orders in life or death situations had changed everything about me. I walked away from a family that was planning to have me killed. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. I saw reporters in the crowd reaching for their phones, but Mitchell's team was already jamming the signals. Nothing was leaving this room until I was done. That's a lie. Victoria shrieked. Richard, tell them it's a lie. But my father couldn't speak. He was staring at me with a mixture of terror and recognition, his face gray with more than just illness. Is it a lie, Dad? I stepped closer to the podium. Is it a lie that you and Victoria planned to have me declared mentally unstable after the wedding so Ethan could control my trust fund? Is it a lie that you were prepared to have me institutionalized or worse if I fought back? You can't prove any of this, Ethan said, but his voice was shaking. I smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Can't I? Agent Martinez, would you like to see the contents of safety deposit box number 4471 at First National Bank of Connecticut? Martinez held up a manila folder thick with documents. Already reviewed, Sergeant Major. Very interesting reading. Particularly the recorded conversations. Recorded conversations. Even I hadn't known about those. My mother had been more thorough than I'd imagined. Victoria made a break for it then. She pushed through the crowd toward the exit, her survival instincts finally overriding her arrogance. But she didn't get far. 2 FBI agents were waiting by the doors. Victoria Whitmore, Martinez called out. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and about 15 other charges we're still cataloging. The ballroom exploded into chaos. Senators were demanding explanations. Judges were quietly slipping toward the exits. The mayor was on his phone, probably already calling his lawyer. But I wasn't done. Not yet. There's something else, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. Something about my mother's death that some of you already know. The room went quiet again. Nothing commands attention like the promise of a bigger scandal. Catherine Whitmore didn't die in an accident. She was murdered because she discovered a corruption ring that extends far beyond my family. A ring that includes several people in this room tonight. I pulled out my own folder, one I'd been carrying for 20 years. My mother was an investigative journalist. Even after she married my father, she never stopped digging. She discovered that Whitmore Industries was being used as a front for money laundering, political bribery, and worse. She was going to expose all of it. I looked directly at Judge Harrison, who was standing near the bar looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Isn't that right, Your Honor? You were one of the first judges on Victoria's payroll. 23 years and counting. Harrison's face went purple. I don't have to listen to this. No, you don't, Agent Martinez agreed. You can listen to it at your arraignment instead. That's when the real exodus began. Half the room started pushing toward the exits, but Mitchell's team was ready. They'd surrounded the building. No one was leaving until everyone's involvement had been sorted out. Ethan tried one last desperate play. Even if any of this is true, what do you want? Money? The company? Just name your price and we can all walk away from this. I looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd been chosen to be my husband, who'd been prepared to control my life and my fortune. You think this is about money? Everything's about money, Eva. You should know that by now. You're wrong. I walked over to my father, who was slumped in a chair, his face gray with defeat. This is about justice. This is about making sure my mother didn't die for nothing. This is about ensuring that no other daughter has to fake her own death to escape her family. I knelt down so I was at his eye level. And this is about making sure you spend whatever time you have left knowing that the daughter you thought was too weak to fight back just destroyed everything you built. His voice was barely a whisper. Eva, I never meant. Yes, you did. I stood up, my mother's locket catching the light. You meant every bit of it. But here's the thing about families, Dad. Real families protect each other. They don't sacrifice their children for money and power. I turned to address the room one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed the fall of the Whitmore dynasty. But don't worry, the FBI has very comfortable accommodations for all of you. 2 hours later, I stood on the steps of the Hillcrest Country Club watching as they loaded Victoria into a federal transport vehicle. She was still screaming about lawyers and political connections, but her voice had lost its power. She looked exactly like what she was, a criminal in handcuffs. Ethan went more quietly, his arrogance finally broken. His wife had already filed for divorce through her attorney. Smart woman. She'd seen which way the wind was blowing. My father was the last to be arrested. The cancer had weakened him so much that they had to bring a wheelchair. As they wheeled him past me, he looked up and met my eyes one last time. I'm sorry, Eva. I really am. I looked down at him, this man who'd shaped my entire life through his cruelty and neglect. I felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. No satisfaction. Just emptiness where all that pain used to live. I know you are, Dad. But sorry doesn't bring Mom back. And it doesn't undo 20 years of letting people believe I was dead. He nodded and let them wheel him away. I would never see him again. He died in federal custody 3 weeks later, his empire in ruins, his legacy destroyed. Agent Martinez walked over as the last of the transport vehicles disappeared into the night. Hell of a thing, Sergeant Major. 20 years of planning. 20 years of waiting, I corrected. There's a difference. So what now? You've got your revenge. The bad guys are in jail. Justice is served. I looked back at the country club, its windows still blazing with light as FBI agents cataloged evidence and took statements from the remaining guests. Tomorrow this would be the biggest story in the country. The Whitmore scandal would dominate headlines for months. Senators would resign. Judges would be impeached. An entire network of corruption would be exposed and destroyed. And somewhere in Connecticut, there was a grave marked with my mother's name. For the first time in 20 years, she could rest in peace knowing her killers had been brought to justice. Now. I smiled, and this time it was genuine. How I go home? Where's home? I thought about that question. For 20 years, home had been whatever military base I was stationed on. But those days were over. I had a pension, some savings, and for the first time in my adult life, complete freedom to choose my own path. I don't know yet, I admitted. But that's okay. I've got time to figure it out. Martinez handed me a card. When you do figure it out, give me a call. The Bureau could use someone with your skills. And your patience. I pocketed the card and walked toward my rental car. Behind me, the Hillcrest Country Club continued to buzz with activity as the investigation continued. But I was done with that world. I'd played my part, delivered my justice, and now it was time to figure out who Eva Carter wanted to be when she wasn't planning revenge. As I drove away, I rolled down the windows and let the cool night air fill the car. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't carrying the weight of secrets and plans for vengeance. I was just a woman driving through the night with nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. It felt like freedom. The radio was playing an old song, something from before my mother died, before everything went wrong. I found myself humming along, something I hadn't done in decades. In the rearview mirror, the lights of Washington, D.C. faded into the distance. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I'd saved but never called, Colonel Mitchell. He'd stayed behind to coordinate with the FBI, but he'd told me to call if I needed anything. Instead, I sent him a text, mission accomplished. Thank you for everything. His reply came immediately, honor was mine, Sergeant Major. You're one hell of a soldier. I smiled and put the phone away. Tomorrow the media would paint me as either a hero or a villain depending on their political leanings. Some would say I was justified. Others would call me vindictive. But their opinions didn't matter. The only opinion that mattered was my mother's, and I could finally look at her picture without feeling like I'd failed her. 20 years ago, I'd run away from a family that wanted to destroy me. Tonight I'd walked back into their world and destroyed them instead. Not with violence or cruelty but with the truth. The same truth they'd killed my mother to suppress. Justice isn't always swift, but it's always patient. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's worth the wait. As I crossed the state line, heading toward a future I hadn't dared to imagine, I whispered the words that had kept me going through 20 years of exile. I love you, Mom. Mission complete. The highway stretched out ahead of me, dark and endless and full of possibilities. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt silenced or betrayed by those who were supposed to protect you, please subscribe to Revenge Tempest. We share stories of justice, truth, and the courage it takes to fight back against corruption. Let me know in the comments where you found us. Your support means everything in this fight for accountability and justice.